Righto, well thanks very much for that, and I thought I'd start the presentation with a pretty controversial sort of a question. It's obviously intended to capture people's attention and maybe get a bit of interest in the webinar, but having said that, it's not as far-fetched as it sounds, so hopefully you'll all keep listening and watching. Just as Greg said, we've got 3 sections here today with pauses for questions. So in the first section I'll be looking at the growth of Brahmans and F1 Senepols in the Northern Territory. In the second section we'll be looking at a feedlot comparison in Queensland and the results from meat quality testing. And in the third section looking at a comparison we did in a feedlot in Indonesia. Firstly, just a bit of background about our Senepol crossbreeding project. The aim was to determine whether Senepol bulls could be used for crossbreeding with Brahman cows to increase the marketing options for Northern Territory producers. And by marketing options I mean to produce progeny that have better meat quality but still perform well under NT conditions, and then allows producers up here to target different markets. So we began the project in 2008 in response to a threat that we saw for the northern industry, where people with high-grade Brahman cattle really only had one market, which was live export. And so we thought that if something went wrong with that market and Brahman cattle had to be sent to domestic markets in southern Australia, that they'd likely be penalised due to the perceptions of poor meat quality. And unfortunately, we actually saw that happen in 2011. So the idea was to find a way for northern Australian producers to produce cattle that did well in our environment but would be in demand in both the live export and Australian domestic markets. So if there was ever another problem like we saw in 2011, we wanted to find a way for northern producers with Brahman herds to very quickly, so in one generation, start producing animals that were more demand in southern Australian markets. So basically that means increasing the Bos taurus content as quickly as possible and by as much as possible. But we still need to ensure that the animals that we breed can cope with our environment, which is fairly stressful, and do at least as well as the Brahmans here that people normally have. So obviously the quickest way to increase Bos taurus genes is to use a pure Bos taurus bull, but that's been done in the past, and the problem is that most of these are terminal size and that they all die. And so the obvious solution for us was to try a tropically adapted Bos taurus breed. And we could have used any tropically adapted Bos taurus breed, such as the Chuli or the Belmont or Bonsmara. We chose the Senepol due to some other traits that we found attractive. The main one was the poledness, and that comes through strongly in the next generation. Also, it was well known for good meat quality, which is the main reason for our program, to try and improve the meat quality of the progeny. And also that there was just a bit more interest in that breed at the time. So a bit of a background on the Senepol breed for those that don't know or not that familiar. So it's a stabilised 2-breed composite from the Ndama, from an African breed from Senegal, and the Red Pole, which is a British Bos taurus breed. And it was developed on an island in the Caribbean and then selected for performance in that fairly tropical environment. Now, I just wanted to really point out that it's important that this presentation is not just an advertisement for one breed. While all the results from our crossbreeding project, which was with Senepol, it's likely that you could get similar results from other tropically adapted Bos taurus breeds or composites. So on to the first section, and this is looking at the growth of the progeny that get produced from our Brahman cows and Senepol bulls. So just on the management, we just bought some Senepol bulls from Queensland and put them out with Brahman bulls on our research station at Victoria River, which is also known as Kidman Springs, and at a paddock we lease on Mambaloo, which is a property near Katherine. And so we had both Senepol and Brahman bulls on both properties, and then the calves that were weaned, the males were sent to our Douglas Daly research farm, which has improved pasture, and we studied the growth of them there. And the females were studied on native pasture at Kidman Springs, on Mambaloo, and at the Katherine research station. So in all of the locations, the two genotypes, the F1 Senepols and the Brahmans that were bred together, ran together in the same paddock under the same management, so that it was a fair comparison. Well, if we get into the data, first if we look at weaning weight, we found that over the 4 year groups of weaners that we produced, the F1 Senepol weaners were on average 23 kilograms heavier at weaning than the Brahmans. That's at Kidman Springs. At Mambaloo, the average was 19 kilograms heavier. Just wanted to point out there that heavier weaning weights are a typical result of crossbreeding due to hybrid vigour. So then, after weaning, if we look at the growth on improved buffel pasture at Douglas Daly, so we used 4 year groups of male calves, and they went to Douglas shortly after weaning, and they stayed there for about a year grazing, all in the same paddock. The paddocks they were in were actually part of a cell grazing trial, so they were all in the same mob at all times, although they did move from paddock to paddock. And what we found there, there's some data there in the table, but basically just to summarise it, the average difference was that over the 4 year groups, the F1 Senepol steers put on 12.3 kilograms more between June and March, which was when we were often having to sell animals to avoid going over the 350 kilogram live export limit. So we did keep the lighter or later born animals for longer, for almost the year, and in those situations, the average growth over the year there was probably around about 140 kilograms a year. So just to summarise that on the steer growth, we had 4 year groups of steers, and each year the F1 Senepols have been about 21 kilograms heavier at weaning, which is, I guess, the average between the two sites at Mambaloo and Kidman Springs. And then they grew about 12 kilograms more over the post-weaning year. So as a result, when they're ready for sale, most of the top end of the Northern Territory anyway targets live export, and generally around the 18 months of age, they were 33 kilograms heavier than the Brahmans that they had been running with their whole lives. So what does that 33 kilograms mean? Well, at current prices, or when I was preparing this webinar, at $2.70 a kilogram, that's $89, which is a fairly significant extra amount of money for each animal, each steer that you're selling. The other thing we found was that the F1 Senepols tend to be slightly leaner at the same weight, so about 1 millimetre when you measure the average P8 fat. Obviously, we had to study the females as well, and so we've done that on native pasture, as I said earlier, at Kidman Springs, Mambaloo and KRS. And generally what we saw, just to summarise briefly, I don't have time to go into this side of it too much today, but we saw that the weaning weights were 26 kilograms heavier, and then over the next year and a half, through to when we join them here as 2-year-olds, they ended up growing more over that next year and a half, and so by the time you got round to joining them, they were 35 kilograms heavier than the Brahmans that they ran with, and after joining we found that pregnancy rates are about 10% higher in the F1 Senepol heifers. So that's an average of a number of year groups there. Just to point out that obviously the performance of the females takes longer to measure. You've got to wait for them to get up to breeding age, and that work's still continuing around Catherine in our research farm and paddocks that we lease there. The early indications are that the F1 Senepols are performing at least as well as Brahmans as first calf heifers, and we'll be putting out more results in coming years as they come to hand. Now, another aspect of why we chose to go with Senepols as opposed to one of the other Boss Taurus breeds was that the poledness was a big attractive feature. We saw that it's quite possible in years to come, with the animal welfare lobby increasing in its making its thoughts known, I guess, that poledness is going to become a very attractive trait. And what we found was that very few animals actually had horns. Most were either polled or skirred. So the skirred gene is a sex-linked trait, and it's dominant in males and recessive in females. And so the proportion of polled animals is higher in the females than males, and that's what we saw if you see the figures there in the table. And there's just a few pictures here for you to see what they look like. So you can see down the bottom in this young steer. There's my mouse there. They're typical of the sort of skirts we saw. We just left them on the heifers to see what they would look like as they got older. And there's some pictures there. There's not a real lot. This animal here's got slightly longer, but they never really got much longer than that, and they were fairly loose, and so we didn't see them as much of a problem. You'll probably see some towards the end of the presentation too in the feedlot steers in Indonesia, but generally, yeah, their skirts were not really a problem. So just a few words of caution when considering a crossbreeding program. So there's a big difference between using tropically adapted Bos taurus bulls and British breed Bos taurus bulls or European breeds. And as I said earlier, it's a bit of a play on words, but those types of bulls have been terminal size up here in the north in that they all die. They just can't cope with the ticks and the heat and that sort of thing. And so people have really come to grief when they've brought them in the past. The other important point is that it's very worthwhile vaccinating Senepol bulls brought from southern Australia or eastern Australia for tick fever. So while Senepols have quite good tick resistance, they're actually just as susceptible to tick fever as British breeds. And so it's a very good idea to make sure that any bulls that you get have been vaccinated for tick fever. Also recommend buying bulls that have been semen tested before transport, because we know that transport can adversely affect that, and they may need a number of months to recover from that after transport in their new environment. And also just to be aware that if you just dump the new bulls out into paddocks with older bulls that have been established in those paddocks, that you're likely to have some dominance relationships at the start. So that's just a management thing to keep in mind. There's plenty of ways to get around that. And like any breed, there's variation within the Senepol breed. And so they're good in bad animals and lines, just as there are in every other breed. So I might pause there and just see if there are any questions.
Thank you, Tim. Yeah, absolutely. We've got some questions coming in. One of the questions, Tim, that someone has asked is, do you also select the initial size on genetic differences for growth, given you were measuring growth?
Okay. No. At the time when we bought our bulls, it wasn't like we just cherry-picked the best ones and chose them on growth. They were just very average, and I don't mean that in a derogatory way, but just in the true sense of the word, that they were just average bulls. So what happened at the time, if you think back to 2008, there weren't all that many bulls available, and our farm manager went over to buy some from Queensland. He actually went to a sale with a pretty limited government budget and couldn't afford the ones at the sale that were presented there. So he approached the stud to see if there were more available that hadn't been presented at the sale, and he was able to buy some out of the paddock. And so having spoken to the breeder and the person that bought them, they were just pretty standard bulls that had not been selected for growth or fertility in any way.
Okay, thank you very much. Another question, what size were the F1s mated to?
Okay, just before I move on to that one, I just probably need to clarify that last statement as it's ringing in my ears. When I say they weren't selected in any way, I mean by us for those traits, I don't mean selected by the breeder, so I just wanted to clarify that. So could you just repeat that next question for me?
Okay, the next question, what size were the F1s mated to?
Okay, so with our heifers, we've got obviously F1 heifers running with Brahmans, and what we've done is one year we put Brahmans back over them, and the next year we put Senepols back over them, and then we've gone back to Brahmans. And so that's just It's like a rotating two-breed cross, which is a fairly simple way. You'd probably do it in the longer term with, for their life, but we've just done it just that we were interested in the fertility of the heifers, not so much in the performance of the next generation of their progeny. So it was convenient for us to do it that way.
Okay, good. One cheeky person has asked whether that's a Senepol cross on the screen, but anyway, I'll ignore it.
No.
Okay, another question. In your selection process regarding polledness and meat quality, how did you establish meat quality for the Senepols? Is any sort of data available?
Yes, and that will be what we're dealing with in the next section of the presentation.
Okay, well, we shall leave that till then. Do you anticipate the heterosis advantage in the F1s to be lost in a composite herd?
Yes, so there is some loss of heterosis in the composite. So once you stabilise it, and it depends how you do that and how many breeds you have in a composite. So if you just were to stabilise it as at 50% Senepol and 50% Brahman, you only end up with 50% of the hybrid vigour that you got in the first cross. But there are ways of improving that, and that's by using other breeds. So the more breeds you include in your composite, the less hybrid vigour is lost. And the other thing is if you do a rotational two-breed cross, you lose less hybrid vigour as well. So there are ways around that, but it is true that we are seeing the maximum hybrid vigour in this first generation, and that in subsequent generations there will be less. And I can go into some figures on that, but perhaps I'll leave that maybe towards the end because I'm pretty sure it might come up again.
Okay, not a problem. We'll take one other quick question before we move forward. How many sires represented each breed over the years?
Okay, so we bought, I think it was 26 Senepol bulls, and I'm assuming we would have had more than that of Brahmans. I haven't actually sort of added up the number of Brahmans that we use, but because we have been using them historically and always have, sort of thing, there would have been at least as many Brahman sires as that were used.
Mm-hmm. Okay, just conscious of time, we might just continue on with your presentation.
Okay, so moving on to the next section, and this is focusing on the meat tenderness, which we've already had a question on, and we wanted to answer the question. Okay, our whole sort of impetus for this program was to try and produce animals with more tender meat. Well, does that really happen, and is there any hard data for it? So what we did, we ran a study in 2013, and this study used the steers that had been part of the growth studies at Douglas Daly. And so what happened there was that the mob of steers that this subgroup was chosen from were on average 28 kilograms heavier when they arrived at Douglas, and then they grew another 10 kilos between July and March when, as I said earlier, we would generally have to get them in and weigh them and see which ones are about to go over the 350 kilo limit and sell them before they did that. Otherwise we were sort of stuck with higher transport costs to send them to other markets. It's not as much of a problem these days, but back then it was. And so on average the F1 Senepols were 38 kilograms heavier at that time in March 2013. So later in that year, so all those that were approaching 350 kilos at that time were sold, and because the Senepols were on average heavier, 54% of the Senepols were sold at this time compared to 16% of the Brahmans. And so the animals for our feedlot and meat quality research were selected from what was left, so what wasn't sold for live export. They were selected from them in July. And so in July in 2013, we sent 25 steers of each genotype to the Smithfield feedlot in Proston, Queensland. And so that's over 3,000 kilometre journey from where we are. So there are a couple of stops for spelling along the way at Brunette Downs and Longreach. And the average weight loss during transport to the feedlot was 12% of the paddock weight, or if the fasted overnight weight was 9%. And so they were fed in the Smithfield feedlot there, just fed the normal commercial ration, managed in the same way as their normal cattle, together in the same pen for 73 days. And there was no significant difference in weight gain in this mob. So they both performed very well with average daily gain of about 1.8. The Brahmans were, the F1 Senepols slightly higher, but that difference wasn't statistically significant. And after the 73 days, the animals were slaughtered at the Dinmore abattoir, and the carcasses were hung overnight, and we had an MSA assessment done the following morning. And then the carcasses were boned out, and a whole strip loin was collected from each carcass and transported to the meat science lab at University of New England, where they underwent meat quality testing. So just to go back to the Meatworks data from the kill sheets and the MSA grading data, what we found was that on average the F1 Senepols were graded into 2 boning groups lower than Brahmans, and so a lower boning group is better, as boning groups are used to determine whether a carcass attracts the MSA prices or whether it doesn't. And so usually it's, well, this Meatworks anyway, it's boning group 9 or lower gets MSA, and if it's above that, they don't. And so the other differences were in hump height, which I'm going to go into in a bit more detail shortly, on muscle area, and just in the body value. So we got more for the F1 Senepols. Now this slide here, this graph shows the number of animals that were in each boning group for the 2 breeds. So the black lines are for the Senepols and the grey lines are for the Brahmans. And so you can see there that the average boning group was 6.3, and there's a bit of a spread around that. For the F1 Senepols, and for the Brahmans it was 8.3 with a spread around that. As I said earlier, boning group 9 or lower gets MSA rates, and above that it doesn't. So a lower boning group is better. Now much of the difference between the breeds in boning group from MSA grading was due to hump height, because in the MSA grading system hump height is associated with tough beef. And obviously Brahmans have a higher hump, and they're, I guess in a way, penalised for that. And so this was some pictures I took in the when the carcasses were hanging up, of them actually measuring hump height. And the one on the left there is a Brahman, and the one on the right is a Senepol. So you can see it's fairly obvious there that there's a difference in hump height, and that has had quite an effect then on how they graded in the boning groups. So at the, as I said earlier, the samples were sent to the UNE Meat Science Lab at Armidale, and they were aged for 14 days, and then the shear force and other meat quality tests were performed. So what we found there was the F1 Senepol meat was significantly more tender than the Brahmans, and on average it was 0.44 of a kilogram less shear force to cut the meat. And we're told from taste testing that people notice differences of about 0.5 of a kilogram, so they would notice that. But I guess the point to make here is that both genotypes tested very well. Shear force values of less than 4 kilograms are considered to be tender, and so that's quite a good result for the Brahmans. And it is low in comparison to other values that have been found from Brahmans. And so Rod Polkinghorne was someone that advised and helped a bit with this stuff, and he says from his data that the average shear force from Brahmans is about 5.5 kilograms, which would be considered to be not tender, and it ranges right up to nearly 17, which must be like chewing on old boots. But anyway, I guess the reason that we've got quite tender meat from both genotypes here is that they're quite young for their age and weighed at slaughter, given that they'd been grazing improved pasture at Douglas Daly and then been through a feedlot. So the conclusions of that is that both genotypes grew well in the feedlot with around 1.8 kilograms a day. They both graded well in MSA, and they both tested well for shear force. So I guess that shows us that Brahman cattle with good meat quality can be produced by production systems in the north where you get good growth rates and obviously utilising that into a feedlot. However, there are not all that many extensive properties in Northern Australia where you can get the sort of growth rates that we get off improved pasture at Douglas Daly. And so in these situations, you might need your crossbreeding to improve your meat quality. And so the advantages that we see of the F1 Senepols is that they graded better, on average 2 boning groups lower, due to their better hump height, their lower hump height, and they were significantly more tender meat. And therefore they've got more, what we'd call more margin for error. So if all of the steers had not grown so well, in that perhaps they were fed for a shorter time in the feedlot or had worse seasons while grazing pasture, or if they grazed on native pasture rather than improved pastures, then more of the F1 Senepols would have still graded below 10, whereas the Brahmans would not have. And this next slide just shows how if you move the relative graph, say if you had a worse year, then you see that a lot of the Brahmans are starting to drop out. And so there's a bit more margin for error, and you're still getting MSA rates because you grade 2 boning groups better for your F1 Senepols. So in conclusion of this section, we just say that crossbreeding with the tropically adapted Boss Taurus breed such as the Senepol appears to be a good way for northern beef producers to produce cattle that do have improved meat quality, that perform as well as Brahmans in our environment, and have more marketing options as they would be more attractive in the domestic markets as well as in live export. So again, just pause at the end of this section for any other questions.
Sure. Yeah, plenty of questions coming in, Tim. There's no two ways about that. One of the questions that has come in is, what percentage of Brahman cow base do you think one can afford, or someone could afford, typically in Northern Territory, to join terminal sires? Is it 15%, 10%?
I don't really understand the question, I'm afraid. If there's another way of asking that.
Okay.
Sorry,
I'll see if I can get that organised. That's not a problem. The cattle that went into the feedlot, were they implanted at all?
I'm struggling to remember. I'm pretty sure they weren't. I think we asked for them not to be here.
Okay.
And I just need to be a bit careful about commercial information and everything like that, but I'm pretty sure that we asked that they were not.
That's okay, not a problem. What was the comparison as a percentage of calves produced to Senepol bulls as to the Brahmans?
Okay. Well, in the first year we had less F1 calves, but there were a few reasons for that, and by the time they got put out at one site at Kidman Springs, it was a bit later than we'd hoped for, and so the Brahman bulls may have already done the job in some cases, and I also, I guess, would say that we saw a few of these dominance interactions as well, so that even at Mambaloo, where we put them all out at the same time, that that they were going into a paddock with these old Brahman bulls that were established, and so in the first year we did get a lower number of F1 Senepols, but after that there was no difference. It was basically 50-50 each year.
Okay, wonderful. Just one more quick question. I'm very conscious of time. Was there a difference in temperament between the F1 versus the Brahman?
Not really. No, I wouldn't say that it was all that noticeable.
Okay. All right. We might just continue with your presentation.
Okay, so the last section is on a comparison we did in Indonesia. And so just to, I guess, set the scene a bit, a lot of us would know that the live export market has been the main destination for North Australian young cattle for many years, and we hope and anticipate that this continues. And so it is important that the Indonesian feedlotters are happy with the cattle that we produce, and if we're going to move from the Brahmans, which they're very happy with, we need to make sure that they're happy with what we move to. And so despite the production and meat quality advantages that we've seen from our research, in talking to some northern cattle producers, we found that they were reluctant to embrace crossbreeding because there's a perception that many of the cattle buyers who buy the cattle for the Indonesian feedlots actually discriminate against crossbred cattle and against cattle that are not high-grade Brahman due to the perception that they won't perform as well as Brahmans in the Indonesian feedlots. And so we did a study to find out whether this perception was actually true or not. And so the aim of the study was to compare the performance of the F1 Senepol and Brahman steers in an Indonesian feedlot. And so we were able to form a collaboration with Elders Indonesia, who agreed to buy our Brahman and F1 steers from Douglas daily and allow us to then study their performance in their feedlot near Lampung in Sumatra. And I just want to really acknowledge the great cooperation and assistance that we were able to get from Elders Indonesia in that. So again, the steers used came from the steers in our growth studies at Douglas that had been in the cell grazing trial. In this case, they were the ones that were sold in March before they went over 350 kilos. So what happened in February last year, we got them in, and any that were over 300 kilos were selected to be sold for this feedlot study. So again, we saw that more of the F1 Senepol steers ended up being selected because they grow faster. And so we had 57% of Senepol steers and 24% of Brahmans. And again, it sort of highlights how your heavier weaning weights and higher growth leads to a higher proportion of your F1s being turned off earlier. So what ended up happening, we ended up with 54 F1 Senepol steers and 32 Brahmans being exported just through the normal live export process. We didn't interfere in that in any way. We basically loaded them onto the truck at Douglas and then went and saw them again at the other end when they were inducted into the feedlot in Lampung. And so the average induction weight was 310 kilograms. The steers were managed then under the normal feedlot management as they manage all of their cattle and fed their normal commercial rations for 121 days. So they get a starter ration for 3 weeks and then move on to the finishing ration. There's a picture of them then, there on the screen. It's quite a modern feedlot. It's quite similar to what you'd see in Australia. And the major ingredients in the ration were tapioca waste, tapioca chips, distillers grains, copra meal, palm kernel, napier grass and molasses. So we weighed and recorded fat depth at both at induction and 121 days later at the end of the feeding period. And there's a whole heap of data on your screen there. It's probably going to be fairly hard to wade through, but the main thing is to see there that the average weight at induction between the two genotypes was pretty similar, just under 4 kilograms higher for the F1 Senepols, just remembering that we chose all the animals within a weight range of 300 to 350 kilos, so you'd expect that the two average weights of that subgroups are going to be fairly equal. And then throughout the feedlot, what we found was that the overall average daily gain was significantly higher in the F1 Senepols. And so they ended up with a growth rate of 1.71 kilograms a day, and the Brahmans were 1.54. Now, what I actually found was that a lot of the Australian feedlot figures are a bit inflated because there's recovery from transport involved in that, and so when I went back and compared the growth rates from their weights just before they left our research farm, the actual growth rates in the feedlots were actually very similar. But anyway, that's sort of really neither here nor there. I just found that interesting. And so what we found was that the average final weight of the F1 Senepols was 25 kilograms heavier by the end of it. And again, there was a significant difference between the two genotypes. And so what that basically means is that over the 121-day feeding period, the Senepol steers put on 21.6 kilograms more weight on average than the Brahmans. So you can see there, there's a graph just showing that how the live weight change over time, that they were fairly similar at induction, and then the further feeding went along, the bigger the difference emerged between the two genotypes, with the advantage to the Senepols. The other thing we found was that when we measured P8 fat depth, that it was about the same in both genotypes, even though the F1 Senepols were on average 25 kilograms heavier. So what that means is that the mature size of the Senepols is just slightly larger, and the implications of that for the Indonesian feedlotters is that they can be fed to heavier weights before they become over fat. So here are just some photos of what the finished steers look like in the feedlot over there. I'll just flick through these. Basically, it's just to show people what they look like. As you can see, the Brahmans and the Senepols were in the same pen together. And there's a bit of a variety in appearance, with some brindle ones, some darker ones, and some lighter ones. Photo there just to show what some of our Brahmans look like, and the feedlot over there was very happy with them too. And again, some more of the steers there. So the steers, they weren't just sent to the wet market. They were sent to the Elders abattoir over at Bogor, and then boned out for the restaurant market. And they found there that the average boning room yield was 2.4% higher in the F1 Senepols than for the Brahmans. And so the conclusion of our work was that so the F1 Senepol steers, rather than performing worse, actually performed better than the Brahmans in the Indonesian feedlot. They put on more weight, 21 kilograms, so obviously they had higher ADGs, were heavier at slaughter, had higher carcass weights. They had the same average fat depth, even though they were heavier, and had higher boning room yields. And importantly, the Indonesian feedlot operators were very happy with them, and therefore the export cattle buyers should be able to buy these types of cattle for Indonesian feedlots with confidence that their clients will be happy with their performance. The other thing is that the better meat quality, the better meat tenderness of the F1 Senepols gives Indonesian feedlotters confidence in the option of targeting the restaurant market in addition to the wet market. So if they want to feed them a bit longer and go for the restaurant market, then they can be confident that they'll be good tender meat. And so I guess in summary there, we found that the F1 Senepols offer production advantages to the Indonesian feedlotters as well as Australian cattle producers. And so what does that mean? Well, I guess the bottom line is that this particular importer is prepared to pay more money for the F1s now, having seen that information firsthand and seen the performance and seen the figures. And so you've got Elders Indonesia now saying that they're prepared to pay a bit of a premium. So if I come back to our question that I posed at the start, what about an extra $100 per steer? You can see there that our extra weight at sale of 33 kilograms at current prices is $89. If you were to get a 5 cents a kilo premium for an average weight at sale of 330 kilograms, that's another $16, which gets us up over the $100. So again, I'll pause for questions, and I guess that's pretty much the end of my presentation. There are some acknowledgements there for funding. I won't go into them in too much detail and just leave people to read them on the screen as questions are being asked and answered.
Righto, thanks Tim. There are a lot of questions coming in. I will try and get through as many as I can within the time frame that we have. One question for you from me: would it be all right for any questions that are unanswered for me to pass them on to you for getting them answered?
Yeah, no problems.
Okay. All right. One of the questions here is, do you have any thoughts as to why Senepols did much better in the Indonesian feedlot compared to a very little difference at Smithfield?
Not really. Initially I thought that the selection process may have worked against them in the Queensland feedlot study, in that we chose the animals from what was left over after the heavier ones had been gone. So I thought, oh well, perhaps all the all the faster growing animals had already gone, and we were left with sort of the dregs. But when I actually went back through the data and compared the growth from when they arrived at Douglas to that date, the average growth of those that went to Indonesia or went to Queensland, there was only the ones that went to Queensland were only 2 kilograms less. So I guess that just says to me that they were lighter at the start, probably because they were younger when they were weaned. And yeah, I guess you know, I don't really have an explanation for it. I would imagine, given that they outperform, the F1 Senepols outperformed Brahmans in every year on improved pasture, and given the other study that we saw in Indonesia, that most times you did it, their higher growth potential would result in more growth. But I guess what we found just in that one group was that there was no significant difference. They were just the same. And yeah, I don't really know why that is, but that's science. You don't always get the result that you expect. But as I said, I think in most situations, just because of their hybrid vigour and higher growth potential, I think that you would find that F1 Senepols would do better.
Okay, thank you for that. Another quick question. As reproduction is far more important for profit than growth, did you assess the puberty of these by either ovarian scans or yearly mating? And if so, what were the results?
Okay, so the answer is probably not properly. I did do a little bit of a, what would you call it, an ad hoc study one year, and it wasn't done very well for a number of reasons, which I'll go into. And I yearly mated 1 year group of the heifers, and the results were pretty disappointing. It was a pretty tough year at Douglas, and the growth of the heifers was not, you know, what you'd want for yearling mating, and so as a result, the pre-mating weights were pretty light. I think they were about, on average, 230 kilos at the start of mating at the end of December. So that would, you know, that's really going to work against getting any decent pregnancy rates. And they didn't grow all that much during mating as well. They were grazing on leukemia, and I suspect that there may have been some issue with transfer of the bug or something, but we just didn't get the growth rates that we thought we were going to get. We tried to set them up so that we'd get good growth, but it just didn't happen. And so at the end of mating, there was still only up to about 280 kilos, which you'd like them to be well over 300 to get decent pregnancy rates. So I guess that there are some mitigating circumstances. The other thing is just to note that when you compare these F1 Senepols to breeds or lines of cattle that have been selected for early puberty for many years, such as we have a selected Brahman line that we have been doing research on that's been selected for fertility for a long time, and we've got a composite line as well, which are extremely fertile at a young age. These F1 Senepols have had none of that selection, so they're just out of commercial cows, and the bulls at that stage hadn't had any selection for early maturity either for scrotal size. Now that's changing, and I'm being told that they're starting to get young bulls with good scrotal sizes. But I guess I'm just pointing out that there are a few reasons why we got very disappointing results from yearling mating with Senepol heifers that we did. The other, I guess I'll probably just leave it there, but just to say that, there's good and bad lines within any breed, and if you start selecting from the highly fertile lines, I'm pretty sure that you could make some real improvements there within the Senepol breed as well.
Okay. We would possibly have time for one more question. Boning group, if we go back to the second part of your presentation, boning group is being replaced by an MSA index. Have you looked at how the animals would grade as or on that MSA index? That can be back calculated and would be interesting to check.
Okay, well the quick answer is no. I'm not really up on those changes. I guess I sort of haven't gone back to that data since doing the study, but if it can be back calculated easily, then that is something that I could do and look into how that's done.
Okay, one quick question just to finish up would be how the animals were handled in a stress situation to how they, in a relationship of how they performed in the foreign feedlot in respect to weight gain. Were they more docile and less flighty?
If I understand the question, and it's asking that perhaps the boat voyage quietened them down, and that by the time they were managed or got to the Indonesian feedlot, they were quieter, and the good management over there helped them perform better. I guess it's possible. I would say that the two genotypes were always mixed together, so the performance, the relative performance, is the same. That they had the same management, and my observation was that the management and stock handling in the feedlot in Indonesia was excellent, like really good low stress handling. So yeah, hopefully that answers that.
Okay, thank you very much for that. We are running out of time. There are a lot of questions that remain unanswered. So to everyone who have not had their question answered, I will forward those questions on to Tim to get some responses to those, and I will send them out to you in due course. So thanks, Tim, for a wonderful presentation and for sharing your insights with us. And a big thank you for everyone for coming along today and interacting with us. Just briefly, don't forget that you can receive your daily emails from the Bee Central crew. And if you haven't yet signed up, then pop over to beecentral.com and do so. Don't forget also to visit our Future Beef website. It's your one-stop shop for beef information across Northern Australia, and in due course you will find the webinar recording there. And as I said earlier, I will send that link out to everyone early next week. Also, while you're on the website, don't forget to sign up to receive our e-bulletins. That way you'll be sure to hear of our future Beef Connect webinars. Now, of course, we will be asking for your feedback in today's event, and we'll be doing that online. And I will include the link in my follow-up email to everyone. So, folks, that's all for today. So thank you for coming along and joining us, and all the best until we meet again. And it's hooroo for now.